Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. Uh, we're Link Labs. I'm joined here by our CTO, Brian Ray, who will be fielding as many of your questions as possible in the chat window. My name is Glenn Schatz. I'm our VP of Business Development. I also head up our cellular product line. Today we're going to be discussing really the business implications for the sunsetting of CDMA and 2G and 3G networks. I will spend a few minutes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, discussing the history and technology and some of the dates. But to be perfectly frank, you could use Google and find the sunset dates. So if that's all you're here for, hopefully you do stick around for the meat of the presentation, which is really how this impacts your business and some of the things that we think about here at Link Labs as we help our customers make the transition from legacy devices to newer IoT devices. So some housekeeping. The agenda today will be giving you a brief overview of who we are at Link Labs, some of the background and history of the various cellular networks that are out there, some key timelines and milestones that you should be aware of. And then really the meat of the presentation, as I mentioned, will be around what this means for your business strategy and what you should be considering moving forward. If you want to ask a question, there are a couple ways to do it. If it's a question that you need answered right away, Brian will be fielding questions in the chat window. Just one note is that we can't see those questions after the webinar is over. So if you think that it's a question that is either too long or too complicated to answer in chat, or something that maybe the whole community would benefit from knowing, I would do it in our forum at forum.link-labs.com. If you have any specific business questions that you don't want shared publicly, you can email me directly or sales@link-labs.com. So just a quick overview about Link Labs. We're a about 4.5-year-old company based in Annapolis, Maryland. We have focused primarily on low power Internet of Things devices since the founding. Brian, as well as a number of our engineers, came out of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, where they were doing similar projects for the government. And really, we saw the commercial opportunity at the time about bringing the expertise we had in low power devices to the broader machine-to-machine or IoT community. And we've had a lot of success since then in lots of different applications. Everything that you see on this screen is something that one of our customers has done, whether it's from tracking endangered rhinos in wilderness parks to metering to tracking container boxes in ports. We take a very best of breed or hybrid approach to connectivity. So you won't find us saying one type of connectivity is best. We like to figure out what the best approach is for our customers, and that could be Bluetooth Low Energy or Wi-Fi. It could be LoRa. It could be cellular. There's a number of different things that work well for different applications, and really there's no sense in trying to squeeze a type of technology into a specific application. We think that the application should determine the type of technology chosen. So briefly, I'm going to go through the history of 2G and 3G and how we got to where we are today. Most of you don't need this background, so I'm going to try to keep it pretty high level and move on to the good stuff. So as most of you are aware of, 2G, what we're calling 2G now, started in the early 90s with GSM, and it was the first real introduction of data service via cellular. It was digital signaling. It introduced SMS and MMS messages that we all take for granted now. And GPRS and Edge brought on packet switch networks as opposed to just circuit switching. And Edge was basically a faster version of GPRS and is what was used by AT&T and T-Mobile. CDMA, which is a technology that's used globally still, was used in the US by Sprint and Verizon, still is. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to refer to CDMA as a separate thing than the GSM, 2G, 3G, but it's all coming to a head soon. So you can think of the networks as network dependent, and for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the US carriers. So if you happen to be joining from outside of the US, your own carriers have your own sunsets, but I believe most of the attendees here are from the US, so I'll focus on that.
We tried to only invite people in the US, so
yeah, good.
We might have failed.
And then moving forward about 10 years, we started to see the beginning of 3G. So all these acronyms are basically evolution of connectivity. It's a little bit confusing because UMTS was actually a WCDMA, but not CDMA as we refer to it here. But it did require carriers to put up new base stations, so there was investment required to move from 2G to 3G. And technically, early LTE is still a 3G technology, according to some of the rules set forth by 3GPP, with LTE Advanced being more of a true 4G. But don't let that confuse you. As people move towards 4G and they refer to LTE, that will all be transitioning to true LTE.
Is that HSPA?
HSPA Plus is kind of this 3.5 or 3.75G, but some people market it as 4G because of the speeds.
Yeah, I always see on my phone, sometimes it says 4G, sometimes it says LTE, and I think that one is HSPA and one is LTE.
Yeah.
LTEA.
Yeah, a lot of that, a lot of calling things 4G is marketing, and until reality catches up with it. But
it never happens.
It never happens in wireless. And then there seems to be a lot of convergence around what 4G is, at least in the US. And so WiMAX, if you're familiar with Clearwire, which was acquired by Sprint, was the only outlier to that for the most part. And the four major carriers now have moved towards LTE. So that provides benefits for manufacturers, device manufacturers. It simplifies supply chain. You no longer need to support networks specifically. So it is nice for most of you who are listening, because you're manufacturers or service providers. And so you theoretically will no longer need to have specific devices for each network, although in practice it will be some time until you can get all of your roaming agreements in place and managing different SIMs for different networks, because the networks clearly want to keep people on their network rather than just going to their competitors and creating a race to the bottom with price. So this is an eye chart. It's actually mostly designed as a takeaway. So for those people that are downloading the slides afterwards, which we'll make available on our website, it just gives a little bit of different comparisons between the peak data rates. There is no such thing as a JBPS, so ignore that. It should be KBPS for GPRS. And you'll see basically a gradual progression in speed, which is what users care about. For handsets. For M2M and IoT devices, not necessarily as important. So when I talk about LTE, I'll talk about LTE Cat-M as well as NB-IoT, which is not LTE but is part of the 3GPP roadmap for IoT devices, and you'll see speeds that are closer to the GPRS, Edge and EVDO speeds. So here's what a lot of people care about, although most of you should already know. You should be having these conversations with your carriers if you have devices. AT&T sunset their 2G network last year around this time. They announced in 2012 or so that they would be sunsetting it, and they stuck to it. Originally, it was supposed to be the end of 2016. I think it ended up, creeping into January of 17 before it actually shut down. So that was real, and it happened. And currently, where we stand today, AT&T is no longer certifying new 3G devices. So what this means is that there is a clear end in sight. It's a bit far off because there are a lot of devices that use 3G, There are handsets that use 3G as well. And so we're looking at more like the end of 2021, maybe even a little bit later for an actual 3G sunset. There have been no announcements about it yet. But if you have wireless agreements with these carriers, you should be looking at the details of when you're guaranteed service through. Verizon is now no longer certifying CDMA devices, and that applies to both 2G, 3G CDMA. It's clear that you wouldn't want to be doing anything new with CDMA, but it is a precipice worth noting that the timeline they give for the end of 2019 is a real one about completely sunsetting CDMA. Now, I'm often asked about exceptions to this, and there are lots of big companies that have lots of devices out there. And from everything that I've heard, the carriers are very serious about this, and the customers that they have at risk, even the big ones, they're working hand in hand with to move them towards a newer technology. As most of you know, the value of these carriers spectrum, and 2G and 3G are pretty inefficient allocations of spectrum, and they want to refarm it and get it to LTE as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, they need to get their legacy devices off of it. So, just some press clippings to know that this is public. None of it is a secret. If you've been in this industry, you've been well aware of this for 5, 7, 8 years at this point. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it's there and it's real. So the whole purpose of this webinar is to not dwell on why it's being sunset, but really how to move forward and what it means for you as a company. So here's where I don't have a lot of pretty pictures, and I'm mostly just going to talk. But I think it's really important, at least the way that we approach this, to think of transitioning from 2G, 3G, not just as replacing a module. There's a lot of customers, especially ones that were really innovative in the 90s and early 2000s, in industries like vending, telematics, security, that were on the cutting edge of IoT, really, before it was IoT, and have had devices in the field for a long time that have served them well, that are stable, that at this point are probably just printing money for them. You might be tempted to just do a module swap out and keep the devices working as is, but we would encourage you to think through your product strategy and use this time of change to really think through what you want to be doing for the next 10 to 15 years, as opposed to how you want to keep legacy devices in the market. It's a little bit ironic that the most forward-looking companies from the past 20 or 30 years are the ones that are hitting end of life. But we think it's a good opportunity for them to dust off the cobwebs of their product development shop. Maybe bring on a few new product managers and really start to think about moving forward and expanding their IoT offering. Some other things that you should think about as you're approaching this transition are hardware constraints. And so if you have existing devices, looking at your supply chain, making sure your module and chip vendors are going to still be producing modules and chips. Just because the networks are available doesn't mean that your vendors are going to have a lot of supply of things that they won't be able to sell after a certain cliff. In some cases, the carriers are artificially limiting what hardware can actually be put on the network. So you'll want to talk to your carrier about that. Another thing that we like to focus on, because this is really our bread and butter, are transitioning powered devices to battery powered. And this, there are some devices that are just going to have line power. Things like ATMs or electricity meters, vending machines, they all need line power to perform their basic function. But there are a lot of devices that don't necessarily need line power or make installation easier without line power. And so if you've had a line powered device, or a device that maybe was battery powered but had a really big battery, or was battery powered but was sleeping for most of the time to conserve battery life, there are some new technologies out there that I'll discuss that really can help you bring new types of applications to a legacy technology. It's also a good time to reconsider how you're doing device management and managed services. And a lot of the systems that you have in place now were set up in the early 2000s or late 90s, and clearly a lot has come out since then. And even though there's no incremental cost or very little incremental cost in using an existing system when you have a device on it, chances are you're going to have to make a change anyway. So it's worth looking at what you can change into as opposed to how you can re-architect your existing system to support the new technologies. The other thing that I would note now is if you're looking at making a change or adding new components to your IoT portfolio, it's a really good time to take a step back and re-examine your overall IoT strategy, which will clearly vary from industry to industry and company to company. But you also need to run a full product development process. This isn't as simple as outsourcing, sending a PCB to a contract manufacturer or to a design house and saying swap this Sierra module for that Sierra module. And in some cases it might be, but we would encourage you to think beyond that and to think through what your actual IoT strategy is going to be, and to not take lightly the challenges of product development, especially if it's something that you haven't done in a long time, because there are lots of hiccups along the way that we don't think that rushing the product through is a good idea in general. The nice part is it's a time of transition. It gives you a lot more optionality. So a lot of vendors are offering similar footprint, similar interface modules, across the various categories of LTE. They're offering footprint compatible things for Cat 1 and LTEM. LTEM and NB-IoT give you a chance to look at even lower powered devices than maybe you were considering. So it's a time of opportunity. We see these transitional times as times where businesses can really differentiate themselves in the market. And if you're on this webinar, it seems to me that you're already trying to do this by staying on top of things. And then the final thought here is we get a lot of questions about 5G. 5G is real from the standpoint as it's being defined by 3GPP. There are some final specifications, or at least preliminary final specifications on what it needs to be. We're seeing press releases on base stations and devices that support it, but in reality, 5G is probably going to be an early 2020s commercial rollout for handsets, and for devices probably a few years after that to get mass adoption. So if you're thinking you want to wait for 5G to make the change, if you're on a legacy device, you can't do that because you're not going to last long enough on your legacy device to do that. And even if you're not on a legacy device and you're thinking through your product needs, unless you have a product that really needs 5G, which is gigabit capabilities, I would make the transition now. These LTE networks will be in the field for a long time, at least through the 20s. And a lot of what 5G is will incorporate pieces of 4G, including Cat-M and some of the lower bandwidth applications. And so, this is one of those things where you want to wait for the next generation and skip one. If you have a product and there's a business case for it, you want to do it now and not wait until 5G is commercially widely available. So I'll spend the next few minutes talking about looking at the technology options available to you. Brian, are there any questions that need to be addressed at this point, or just keep moving? Great. So, some of the considerations that you need to take into, or some of the things you need to take into consideration are power constraints. That's probably the biggest one that will drive you one direction or another towards one of the always-on LTE technologies versus one of the lower bandwidth, lower throughput, but power efficient LTE technologies. You need to understand what data throughput is required. Most machine-to-machine and IoT devices don't require a ton of data throughput. They're sending bursty messages. Latency can typically be a little bit lower. If you're doing something like telemedicine, clearly you're going to want the higher data rates and lower latency technologies, but typically your application will be able to support that from a cost standpoint. The other thing that you need to look at are network availability and then the overall cost. And there are a lot of components to cost, so I'll focus on that specifically. But this is a slide that I stole from one of our previous webinars discussing what we offer. But really looking across the board, these are all the things in a typical cellular IoT system. Most of the folks on the webinar are on the left-hand side of the screen, so they have a sensor, some type of application that they need to integrate with a module. I'm sure there are some of you out there that focus more on the application side, on the front end. But for the most part, if you're concerned about 2G, 3G, CDMA sunset, you're on the device side. And so we break out your application from the module. As I mentioned, most of the modules are now moving towards common footprints or common pinouts, as well as common interfaces or easy to migrate interfaces. The module vendors are definitely keeping up with the technology, and so the vendors I have here are all the CAT-M vendors, but there are other vendors out there. If you're working with a U-Blox or a Telit or a Sierra or a Gemalto, they have a lot of information on their websites about product families, and so I'd encourage you to look at that to look at the different options you might have if you do a single design or a family of designs yourself. Being able to pick a vendor that will allow you to move forward as technology advances and continue to advance without a ton of extra development cost. If you have any specific questions about vendors, we're familiar with all of them. Please feel free to reach out independently. We call ourselves vendor agnostic, but we do have some that we like, from a technology standpoint or from an ease of doing business with or integration standpoint. So feel free to reach out to me and we can discuss different vendor options. And this is from OpenSignal. Ignore the China gray. China has about 70% coverage of LTE. As you can see, LTE is pretty available globally. And it doesn't mean that when I say LTE, it's could mean different speeds, different data rates, different types of qualities of service. But LTE is a relatively global technology, unless you're talking about Africa and then the more rural parts of China. But if you're in Chinese cities, LTE is going to be pretty reliable.
Yeah, with the major caveat that unlike GSM, the band selection is just literally all over the place.
That's true. That's very true. And so it still may force you into either defining hardware specific to specific countries and carriers, or software-defined radios.
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to pay a premium for LTE systems at the front end that can handle, near global roaming.
Mm-hmm.
You can always save by doing more, country-specific front end.
That's true, and I know a lot of you have devices where cost is a big concern. So it's really a matter of operations at that point. Can you support multiple SKUs for multiple regions? Or is it better for you, given your volumes, to go for a more global approach? And it really differs device to device. For example, at Link Labs, we have both strategies in place for different types of hardware. So we have carrier-specific LTE-M hardware. We have global LTE for some of our more heavy data rate and data usage applications. And so it really depends. And this is all part of that product development roadmap process that I mentioned earlier. It's not just the hardware.
Somebody asked a question about whether 3G fallback is something good to look at. I mean, I think that if you can afford a module that in your application that has that, especially if you're looking for, more than one country, that is a great option.
Yeah, I do. I agree with that. In fact, 3G fallback is a requirement in certain applications that we have, just because we know the device might roam in an area where LTE coverage isn't everywhere. And most devices that have 3G fallback also have 2G fallback, and there are some places where 2G will continue to be out there, not in the U.S. necessarily, but globally, 2G sunsets are kind of all over the place. And then just a quick nomenclature overview. There are different categories of LTE. There are up to, I think, 12 UE categories now. For the most part, we're talking about Cat M through Cat 5 or Cat 6. The majority of the webinar, so I perused the list of attendees and the companies, and I would say for the majority of you, you're going to be want to look at Cat M or Cat 1, and it's primarily a cost driver. It's more simple hardware. You don't need a gigabit speed or 300 megabits per second speed on your devices. So, but the nice part is as the modem and module prices get cheaper for the higher speed devices, in a lot of cases it is a footprint compatible swap out, so you can change over. Or if you have applications that require higher speed, the ability to choose between a category is relatively straightforward. Typically, the higher speed devices have more built into the module. And so you'll see more processing built into the module, maybe the ability to host bigger applications on the module itself, because those devices tend to be more expensive. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about Cat M1 specifically, because that's really where we do most of our work. Cat 1 is, I would say, the most inexpensive traditional LTE device out there. There are things you can do to make Cat 1 more power efficient on the application side, and we do some of that in the way that we implement our Cat 1 devices by turning it off and basically managing sleep and wake up and different power savings features on the application side. M1 has a lot of that built in. So if you're interested in M1, we did a webinar about 2 months ago where we went into a lot of detail on Cat M1 and what it is and how it works. But for the purposes of this webinar, all you need to know is that there are 2 modes in Cat M1 that make operations in a power efficient way possible without a ton of application work. That's PSM or power saving mode, and EDRX or extended discontinuous receive mode. PSM is designed for devices that are going to be mostly sleeping and don't need to be reached when they're sleeping. And then EDRX is designed for devices that need to be reached but can afford a little bit of latency, anywhere from 10 seconds to 40 minutes or so of latency. The caveat with M1 is that it's not globally available. It's likely never going to be globally available like LTE networks are. There's a lot of countries or companies around the world that are deciding, whether they want to deploy M1 or NB1 or some adjacent unlicensed technology. In the markets that we serve, M1 is the most logical and the most prominent technology. It covers the Americas, Japan, Korea, most of Western Europe will support M1. Eastern Europe, China, EME, or the Middle East, Russia, it's kind of a hodgepodge, and you'll have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But if you're predominantly serving the North American market, that includes Canada and Mexico, M1 is a safe bet for you.
Yeah, and I'm having a little bit of a discussion here on costs of LTE. I think that, previously Cat 1, Cat 3, Cat 4 LTE devices really were prohibitively expensive for M2M applications, but I do think that LTE-M addresses that pretty adequately. We're seeing chipset and module costs that are on par below what you can get, standard 3G, data modem for. And that, I think, is the real reason that one of the reasons that the carriers pushed to adopt it was to provide a low-cost path for 3G data devices.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, modem costs now are under $10 in higher volumes. Those will come down. And when I say modem, I mean actual module. So these are FCC certified modules. They still need to be integrated into a device and then certified with the carrier. But it used to be $50 for that same thing for an LTE Cat 4 module, and now you're seeing $10, and even in high volumes even in low volumes under 15 or so. I think there's a couple lower cost ones that are advertised at $7 or something for from quantity one. So I could very easily see the module cost for M1 and NB1 getting to the $5 price point within the next few years as volume starts to ramp up in deployment. So, you'd be hard pressed to find a 3G or 2G modem for that price unless it's just liquidation at this point. So, as you're thinking about this, though, the component cost is part of your longer term concern, but really the design cost is actually what I would focus on initially. What we find at Link Labs is that customers come in with a very simple idea of saying, I want to take this temperature reading or I want this GPS location. And then by the time they're done in the initial scoping meeting, they've added 3 more IOs and then logic at the endpoint. And they want it to be the size of a coin, and they start adding all of these requirements, and which is it's fine, but you have to understand your business case and your market. And if you are going to be doing 1,000 devices a year, you're going to have different constraints on how much you're willing to spend on design as if you're going to be doing 1 million devices a year. So most of the cost in design revolves around the complexity of the application and the complexity of the device. And the things that drive complexity of the application really are how smart the application is and how much it needs to do at the endpoint. And then in terms of complexity of hardware design, really size and battery life are going to be the bigger drivers there. Antenna can be an expensive piece of it. The types of applications that are simple are things that are relatively form factor agnostic, so they can be small, but they don't need to be tiny. The batteries can use typical off-the-shelf batteries or standard LiPo batteries, for rechargeable type devices, and that can use regular off-the-shelf antennas, whether it's small sticker antennas or wire antennas, and have the performance you need for your application. The cost of that design can vary broadly. We've seen things as little as $10,000 or so worth of NRE up to $1 million plus. And so one of the important things that you'll need to do as you begin this process is spend a lot of time getting a detailed assessment internally of what the product needs to be, and then take that detailed assessment that you've made about the application and the product. And if you're working with an outside firm, make sure you define the requirements well before they start. Otherwise, it can explode into hundreds of thousands of dollars of unanticipated costs. And even if you're doing it internally, internal product development teams aren't free. And so you want, as the product owner, to define the product for your internal R&D and product team. So component costs. Sorry, I was a slide behind. So component costs, again, this is from a previous slide on Cat M devices, but this will really apply to, I think, most Cat 1 devices as well. If you're using a Cat 4 or Cat 6 device, it'll be more expensive on the module side, but not dramatically so. So you can increase by maybe $20 depending on what type of module you're using. So a typical application that we see at 10,000 units a year, the sensor, the host MCU, the memory, the manufacturing of the PCB, some other components just in the $10 to $30 range, the module itself, the SIM holder, the level shifters, connectors, all the things that you need to incorporate that module. It's another $20 or so. And then your antenna and battery, I erred on the high side here because what we find is a lot of people try to skimp on antenna especially and find it doesn't meet their requirements. And so, don't skimp on antenna, as we have an office full of RF engineers that would tell us that every day. But on the business side, we sometimes don't listen because we try to cut costs, but don't skimp on your antenna. And then enclosures can vary from, an off-the-shelf enclosure from $5 to $10 to some really cool custom IP67 and explosive-proof, thing that you're going to spend lots of money both designing and building.
Yeah, just to hammer on the antenna thing. It's important to understand that a lot of carriers, even for LTE, have 4 or 5 different bands ranging from UHF to S-band, and you have to have an antenna that is responsive in all those different bands if you want it to work everywhere. That is one of the real benefits of Verizon having a single 700 megahertz nationwide LTE band for LTE-M, is that getting a 700 megahertz antenna is cheap and easy. Other carriers have had to build their spectrum footprints, over time. So just keep that in mind. And then if you want to go global with, modules that work in all the countries, you're getting down to, you're giving up a lot of gain in exchange for wideband performance. So just keep that in mind. Nothing's free. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Speaking of not free, certification. So this is again focused mostly on North America, but to get onto the AT&T or Verizon networks, you'll need either PTCRB for AT&T or Verizon specific certification for Verizon. This can cost anything from, on the low end, 10,000 or so. Well, if you're using a pre-certified module, for on the FCC side, it potentially could be less if you're using a pre-certified module antenna, basically one of the, like a socket modem type of device. On the Verizon and AT&T certification side, one of the benefits of working with a company like us is we actually have end device certified or network ready modules. And we're not the only ones. There are several other companies that have that, which essentially have done all the testing that the carriers care about for you. So, they have a defined interface with the network. They incorporate properly matched RF modules and chipsets. Make sure the antennas are predefined. So, in terms of form factor and flexibility, they may be a little bit less flexible, but you save the $5 to $10,000 on additional carrier certification for those types of devices. If you're doing 1 million devices and you're doing a chipset specific certification, that can cost $1 million depending on what you're doing. So we'd encourage you to use modules. We would encourage you to use the pre-certified or network ready modules like ours. If you can't use something like that, then using something like Gemalto or Sierra or uBlock's certified module and then going through additional carrier certification is the way to go. We would definitely not encourage most everyone on this call to incorporate the chipset themselves. Is there a question there, Brian? Or I see Brian chatting away over there, so he's good at fielding these questions in real time. So it's helpful to have your CTO as your assistant.
As long as your computer doesn't crash.
As long as your computer doesn't crash.
Or your computer.
That was last time. So, and then the other driver of cost, of course, once you deploy your application, is the data. And if you're coming over from a legacy plan, you may be at a point where you're paying a couple bucks a month for 50 megabytes of data. Part of that is because the carriers are trying to figure out ways to monetize an asset that's there until it phases out. And so the costs of 2G, 3G specific plans or CDMA specific plans have come down over the years. One of the things to remember as you transition to, really this is CAT-M, but the other plans matter also, especially if you're on a device that's not transmitting that much data, is they tend to be pretty expensive on a per byte basis. And so for, if you have a Cat6 modem in a router, you're probably paying $10 a month or something like that for a gigabyte of data. Whereas if you have a Cat-M device in a GPS tracker, you're paying $1 a month for a megabyte. So that's 100 times more expensive. In reality, it's they're in between layers where you might get a 100 megabyte plan or a 500 megabyte plan. That this is maybe a little bit more affordable. But one of the biggest things that we encourage our customers to do when they're in the scoping part of their project is to really understand how much data they need, how much data is required to serve their customers' needs, as opposed to how much data can we send, because you could send lots of data, but that has a cost from both a battery standpoint, which is to us the most important piece, but also from a cellular service standpoint.
Yeah, and that's one place where we really focus is trying to get bit efficiency really high, so that our customers aren't paying to transmit overhead, TCP overhead. So we've seen about 10x improvements in our bit efficiency on LTE with some of the innovations we've had in the last few months.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I'll get into a little more detail about that in a few slides when we talk about our approach to it. The way that Link Labs does things isn't necessarily the right way for everyone, but we wouldn't have done it unless we thought it was a good idea. So I will spend a few minutes on that. And the final piece, which may or may not be transparent to you now, is the managed service piece of it. So my guess is a lot of you right now are using, like a global SIM or an MVNO type of arrangement for your M2M devices if you don't have direct contracts with the carriers. So you're using something like Aris or Core or Sierra, even who makes modules, but also is an MVNO with their SIMs. Device management is handled through them. It may not always be the most user-friendly thing in the world, but you know how to use it. But when it comes to the types of capabilities and newer IoT devices, you're going to need more than that in a lot of cases. So if you're working directly with a carrier, you may be using Jasper. So if you have more devices with specific carriers, a lot of carriers have adopted them. But things like managing SIMs across carriers, especially in a technology like LTE, where not all carriers have roaming agreements. In fact, very few do now. Things like application enablement, active management of data rates and transmissions, moving some of the power and data management to the platform side, third-party billing and FODA. Those are all things that you may or may not have in your existing platform. So I'd encourage you, as you're looking across your overall product portfolio, to consider the types of services that you need in the back end, and to really take a look at other managed service providers, because things have come a long way in 20 years. And if that's the last time you've looked at where your data is going, then you may want to spend some time looking at what's available now. As Brian mentioned, we really focus on battery efficiency and data efficiency. And so to this end, we have a very specific approach. We think it's very flexible on the device side, but between the device and the application, it is pretty fixed. And so we expose a UART API as opposed to AD commands. In that API, we allow you to choose from a number of power settings based on your application. We handle that all through a private APN and an IPsec tunnel directly from the cellular network to our virtual private gateway and router in our virtual private cloud. That minimizes the amount of security overhead that you have to use to make sure you have secure communications. So just for example, doing a HTTPS communication with a device is about 50 times the overhead from how we handle secure comms using our approach. So if you're paying $1 a megabyte, it's worth considering that. And then at the back end, we have a REST API that makes it relatively easy to get your data, put it into your application, and do what you need to do with it. As I mentioned, this isn't necessarily for everyone, especially if you've built out pieces of this yourself. But we're pretty flexible, and I'd love to have a chance to talk to you about our approach and why we think it works. And again, there's more detail on this specific approach in the other webinar we did a couple months ago. But please do reach out, and I can talk through a little more detail on each of these different areas that we've put in, our end-to-end platform from hardware to the cloud. So this is where we sell our services to you. So how can we help you? We pride ourselves on a relatively unbiased expertise. Clearly, we think we do things right, and so we like our approach to things. But in terms of hardware, cloud services, types of connectivity, we're relatively unbiased. There's certain pieces of it that we like to use repeatedly, but if you have something in mind that you want to bring to the table, we're always open to new ideas. We have a very experienced professional services team, decades of experience, if not, in the three digits of experience doing low power devices. And I will reiterate that our team, all of our hardware and firmware engineers have focused nearly exclusively on low power devices. And it really is a different game from some of the powered devices you have there. The level of sophistication in the application code, it's different. And so if you don't have experience with low power or battery powered devices in the past, I would encourage you to reach out or find someone like us to help you. And then the other thing that we can help you with, which I'll go into a little more detail in these last few minutes, is this risk-free transition assessment. Notice I say risk-free, not cost-free. But we think that it's worth the money, whether you do it internally or externally, to take a step back and try to assess the overall product or service that you're trying to deliver before even going out and buying a dev kit and digging into it, because these things we've seen projects like this balloon when things aren't well defined at the beginning. So just a shout out to our professional services team. We have full stack capability. We have clearly the project management, solutions architecture at the beginning phases, but we do our hardware and embedded firmware in-house. And one of the offerings that we'd like to highlight here is the senior leadership consultation or executive level consultation. Given that we've seen a wide swath of products from different industries since we've been in business, and through both our direct customers and our partners, we can help you with some lessons learned and mistakes that we've seen other people run into over the years. We think this is a really important piece of our professional services offering, and if you engage with us, you'll have senior level consultation with C-level folks at our company. I mean, clearly Brian is in the room answering questions, and so our executives don't really skimp on getting their hands dirty here. So that's a big part of our professional services offering. But we do have a dedicated team separate from our internal R&D team that will handle professional services. And then the assessment that I want to highlight, it's you want to be able to walk away from the assessment with certain deliverables. So this isn't just a 10-page consulting study for you analyzing the market and barriers to entry and doing a 5 forces analysis. This is a really specific engineering assessment where you will walk away with a product design specification, our best guess on the viability of your product, as well as the costs, and then as we mentioned, the battery life and the data are very important to us. And then the nice part about this assessment is that if you decide to stay with us after, we'll wrap the assessment cost into basically phase 1 of your project. and if you don't, you have something that you can take to a third party or you can use internally to help roadmap your own product team. So, something like this we typically see run in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, taking a couple weeks of work. They can go more depending on your application, but that's a good benchmark. So we'd encourage you to invest that time and money up front. You get a lot out of it. It's almost priceless when it comes to product development and doing something like this, whether you do it with us or internally. But this is all part of the process that I talked about earlier when I talked about having beginning a true product development process with this transition, and not just trying to swap out a module, because we think it's really more than that. So with all that, you can find us in lots of places. If you need to reach out directly, sales@linklabs.com, or you have my email address from the several emails that you've received from me. We have a web store. We're also carried by DigiKey, Future, and Arrow. So if you're interested in shopping, you can go to any of those places. And with that, I will turn it over to any questions that Brian is fielding that.
No, I think I was able to whack them down as we went along. So I put our email, sales@link-labs.com. I'll watch those over the next couple of days to see if anybody has any specific questions. But we enjoyed this, and if you're watching this on a recording, you can also reach out to sales.
Yeah, we'd encourage you to use the forum.
The forum site is a really good resource as well.
Yeah,
we watch that like a hawk. So thanks again.
Yep, thank you.